evening. My name is Andrea Ellis, and I am joined by Christina Chandler. And what we're going to do today is share with you some information about a series that we put together. So I'm going to tell you a little bit how our format is going to go, and then what we're hoping is through our conversation, you'll learn more about who we are, so we don't just sit up here and tell you a whole bio at once. But we put together this series of conversations with the Kansas City STEM Alliance that was looking at how to think about closing the racial gap in STEM. And so what we're going to do is Chrissy is going to interview me first. My role was the moderator of the series, and then I was working with Callan, who's back there, the marketing person for the KC STEM Alliance, and we actually crafted the document that I think Callan has a few of them. If anyone wants to grab one, I think she'd be willing to hand it over. But we worked together to kind of craft this document based on that conversation in the series. And then Chrissy, and her expertise, and she'll talk more about what she does, is that she's taken the framework that we've created in here that's encouraging people to think about how they can help close that racial gap, and she's integrating it into the work that she does for the KC STEM Alliance as well as a teacher in the school district. So that's kind of how we're going to flow. She'll interview me first, and then I'll change gears, and I'll interview her a little bit about how she is utilizing this resource that we put together. So we both are educators, though, formal and informal educators. So if you guys have questions, we're happy to take those. So please jump right on in. But we'll get started.
All right, and I would say he was being modest. Andrea is more than a wonderful person. It has been my privilege to work alongside her doing this work and learn from her and gain from her knowledge and expertise as well. So I'm just gonna jump right in and ask Andrea, tell us a little bit about yourself. And I'm really excited for you to share with everyone the new role that you've taken on.
Okay, so my professional career has been in informal education, so primarily working with students in the out-of-school time space around media production and youth development, youth leadership, that kind of thing. Most recently, I was at the Kansas City Public Library, and they had hired me to look at creating what was called a learning lab in the library space. So how do we really bring kind of learning into this space, because we have a lot of students that come into the library. So we created a digital media lab, which resides at the Southeast branch of the Kansas City Public Library. Hi, Ron. And it's a space where students between the ages of 12 and 18 can come in and do all kind of robotics, media production, audio production. We got an audio suite in there, and it's free of charge, right? And they can just come in and be creative, and we start to introduce them to those elements of STEM. And then most recently, as Chrissy alluded to, I took a position after 10 years at the library, which was wonderful. I took a position with the Kansas City Action Fund. So it is a new startup education advocacy organization where we're kind of focused on pushing kind of at that system level in terms of getting the 26,000 kids that are in this Kansas City Public School District the education that they greatly deserve, right? And supporting parents, teachers, and students in that work.
Right, thank you for that. What I love about Andrea, and you're going to hear this, and I love the direction she took this work, is that a lot of times, someone said it well, we can sometimes get Kansas City stuck. And Andrea does a very good job of making sure that whatever we do is actionable. Something's going to come from this. We're not going to be Kansas City stuck. So with all the wonderful things that you do, what got you interested in being a part of this project?
Yeah, so when I first heard that Kansas City STEM Alliance was going to do this work, I wanted to be involved because I wanted to make sure it was done the way I thought it should be done. Like, I won't say right, because, I guess right could be different for different people. But for me, it was very important that we were intentional about the voices that were at the table, right? And so Chrissy and I worked together on this, is making sure that there were a variety of students, there were teachers, there were administrators, and then there were also folks from the nonprofit community as well as funders. So we wanted to make sure that we got as broad a voice, and then also across race, right? We have very diverse race, gender, age. So that was important to me, first of all. And then second of all, I did also want to make sure that at the end of it, it wasn't just a series of conversations, because I was very clear that there are a lot of people in Kansas City having conversations. Like, we're all having conversations, and that's important work. But I wanted to make sure that we would be able to create something that I felt could be actionable from this work. So that's why I signed up.
What was one of the biggest surprises from the conversations that we had?
So let me just start that by saying what wasn't surprising, just because it leads to what was a little bit, is that you'll see that on one page we have kind of the barriers. So we asked the panelists to kind of talk about what are some of the barriers that they're experiencing as it relates to closing the racial gap in STEM. And some of the things that you expect came up, right? Funding, lack of representation, lack of expectation. Like, a lot of the educators talked about working with students of color and feeling like they were seeing some of their peers not necessarily having high expectations for those kids of color, but sometimes even the kids themselves. And as somebody who's worked firsthand with young people of color quite a bit, I've seen that a lot. Like, they don't see themselves in STEM roles naturally, right? And so those things weren't necessarily surprising, but some of the ways that our panelists talked about them did hit me in a little bit of a different way. For instance, Derek Pruitt, who works at Center, who Christy brought to the table, and he does robotics out there, and talked very heavily about how he had to kind of help change the mindset around how parents were looking at robotics. And one of the ways he did that was looking at equating it with athletics, right? Because oftentimes we are funding schools well with the athletic program, and the question became, well, why aren't we doing the same thing with something like STEM, where we know that there are more opportunities out there for students to get jobs in STEM than there are for them to be professional athletes? I mean, great, if that's their dream, let's help make it happen. But just the ratio of opportunities is so much greater in STEM, and yet we don't put the funding behind it to make it a reality for a lot of students. And so that was kind of interesting to think about it a little bit differently.
So thinking about the work that you're doing now, how did these conversations and this webinar series and your learning, how does it inform the work that you do now in the city?
Right, so I think the biggest thing that these conversations reinforce for me that directly aligns with the work that I'm doing now is this reminder that those most proximate to the issue have something of value to contribute to the conversation, right? So, like I said, the panelists that we were very intentional. So we had students on there who had very, impactful things to say about what was happening and what their experience was. And we also had teachers who also were able to talk very specifically about what they're seeing in the classroom. So I think that I walked away kind of being reinforced of the value of making sure that we are having conversations with those most proximate to the issue, which are parents, teachers, and students, which we often miss out on. And so in my current position, that is really one of my major responsibilities, is as we look at having impact on policy or making recommendations in the education space, our process is we start with the data, we look at what the data is telling us, and then we are taking that data and putting it in front of those most proximate students, teachers, and parents. We're getting their feedback, and that's going to inform what we will throw kind of our full weight behind in terms of trying to have an impact on the education system. All right, and so I'm gonna jump into, so Chrissy also has an amazingly impressive resume. So I would love for you to kind of share with them so that they can get a scope of kind of what your background is, because it's pretty dynamic. So if you could.
Well, Jasper got up here and started throwing out these big numbers about how long we've been knowing each other, so I'm just gonna go with it. So when we were in community college together, still trying to figure out what we wanted to be when we grew up, I got a job at Black & Veatch, and initially it was supposed to be an administrative assistant, but I've always been interested in technical things. They saw I had an aptitude, and they said, hey, there's this thing that's about to happen called Y2K. we need someone who can apply patches to all of these engineers' laptops and then do a little bit of training and troubleshooting and that sort of thing. So that was my entrance into technology at Black & Veatch. So I worked with a group of engineers, about 100 of them. There was a small office team, and those engineers in that small office team, I was the only person of color and one other woman. And so then I left Black & Veatch and I went to another organization at Health Midwest, where I worked in the IT department there, was going to school, learning, just growing in all my knowledge, started doing some web design, some network support. Again, I was the only person of color in that IT department. I'm thinking, this isn't for me. I need to go do something else. So actually, when I stayed home with my son for a little bit, ran daycare for a little while, realized that if I don't put him in a daycare or a school or something, he's not gonna be very bright, because every time I tried to, let's read a book together, his favorite thing was, no, mommy. So I put him in daycare with people who could educate him, and I went to work in a elementary school in the office. And after a year and a half, again, that my love and that aptitude for technology came back, and they asked me if I wanted to work in the IT department. I worked in the IT department, and I was a workstation network technician, and my director said, this isn't for you. You can be doing more than this. So what do you want to do in the future? And I said, wait, I like you. I'm going to do this until we retire, right? And he's like, that's not going to work, because I got a few years on you. I'm almost there. So he said, have you ever thought about being a teacher? You do such a good job. You can teach people how to do hard things. And that was profound for me. It was a talent I never saw in myself. So I went back to college. I got my bachelor's in education. And because I had worked, there's this rule within the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. In order to teach a computer science class that gets a student like an industry certification, that teacher had to have worked in industry for 4,000 hours. So how often do you have teachers who came from the IT industry? So the superintendent found me, and she approached me and she said, would you be willing to build an information technology program to get students at the alternative school computer certifications? And I said, sure. She said build. I didn't hear that. I heard teach. So I'm like, yeah, give me all the stuff. I'm ready to go. Let's do this. She was like, no, I don't have anything. We're going to pay you this summer, and you're going to create it. And so I'm like, okay. And it really, I feel like as an educator, I got a really unique perspective, because I had the opportunity. A lot of educators, they go high school, college, classroom. I got that extra step where I actually had the opportunity to work in industry. So how do I apply this to a classroom that actually prepares kids to step out into the real world? So I built a class called Business Technology, which shows them how technology works in a business, computer hardware and operating systems, which is called Chaos, where they were able to get 2 different industry recognized certifications, 3 if they really pushed. And even at the alternative school, with some of our most challenging learners, I was able to get them some IT certifications. I eventually became a victim of my own success, and they said, okay, it's time to move this to the high school. And so I was moved to Center High School, where I still teach there part-time, but I also took on the role of developing some robotics programs. My nephew said, hey, come and see my robotics competition. And I was like, okay, I don't know what this is, but sure. It was amazing. There were kids running around, programming. They were using words like, my robot's running autonomously. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. So while I was there, someone said, would you be willing to start a robotics team at Center? Sure, why not? Let's give that a shot too. So I went back and I started my first robotics team in Center Middle School. If any of you are familiar with the Center School District, that district is about, okay, I have one Center School District fan back there. There we go. All right, a bunch, all right. The district is really diverse. I would say as a whole right now, 85% multicultural student population. The kids that were showing up for the robotics team, they did not match that demographic. So I started to ask myself why. And I began just with my little robotics program, which I eventually scaled across the district, to remove some of those barriers that I was noticing that were keeping kids from showing up. Eventually, I love robotics so much, I took the role of the program delivery partner for FIRST LEGO Robotics for the Kansas City region with the Kansas City STEM Alliance. And then Martha approaches me and says, she's the executive director of the Kansas City STEM Alliance, and says, would you be willing to lead our diversity, equity, and inclusion work? And I said, sure, I'm gonna have to, I can't teach full-time and do this, so something's gotta go. So I went down to just teaching a few hours a week to lead this work, because I have been working with robotics teams for 10 or 12 years. We were still in the same place. So it was time to do this on a larger scale and really start to make an impact in making sure that Black and brown students felt like they had an opportunity here. So when I started, Martha was just introducing the idea of closing the Racial Gap series. And so then I got the privilege of immediately, day one, working with Andrea on this amazing project.
And I think it's wonderful that the students get to have an opportunity to have a teacher who has had that practical experience and bring it into the class. When I was at the Kansas City Public Library, we did a FIRST team as well for robotics. So we had an experience with FIRST that was challenging. So our team was primarily African American, and our experience was challenging, which I had talked quite a bit with Martha. And I know that is something that you've been very intentional about in the work that you're doing with the KC STEM Alliance, is to look at how to make that environment more inclusive. Because it is, I don't know if any of you guys have been to a robotics, it is amazing, right? It really is exciting, and the kids get excited. But then when you have a couple of those brushes with racism, to be frank, it makes it not the experience that it really could have been for those students. So I love the fact that is a lot of the work that you've been doing, and I would love it if you could talk about, because as you were coming on to KC STEM Alliance and starting this project with the series, you were trying to define your role at the KC STEM Alliance and what it would be. And I know some of this work informed ultimately what you decided to do. If maybe you could talk about how those things came together and connected for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the main things that came from this work is the idea of creating a sense of belonging. And what I realized was, it was something I always knew, but just hadn't put that phrase to. And so what I realized is that our FIRST robotics community, which is huge here in Kansas City, does not as a whole have that sense of belonging. So what I did was, in my role, every single opportunity where a student, no matter what that student's background, ethnic background, racial background, whatever it is, that student was going to have a sense of belonging in every robotics event or every event that they attended, as much as I could help it. So we talked about earlier, when we talked about creating that sense of belonging and making sure the students have contact with someone that looks like them. They can at least see that person. So we made sure at our FIRST robotics competition events, this is the high school program, I worked intentionally to make sure we flooded that space with professionals of color. So even if they weren't judging, even if they weren't there as coaches, even if they weren't volunteering, they were just walking around shaking hands so that our students of color could see people that looked like them. So just being very intentional around this work also helped me develop our strategic plan for the KC STEM Alliance and the Kansas City STEM ecosystem around diversity, equity, inclusion, and solutions. That's another thing that happened, is that my title changed, because we recognize, as Andrea always said, this work can't be performative. There has to be a solution on the end of it. So we added the solutions to my title, because that's an important part. It may be the most important part of this work, that in the end, we're doing something. We're coming to some sort of conclusion and creating something actionable.
So you talked about already one aha moment you had about the belonging. Was there anything else in this series that was kind of an aha moment for you?
There were a lot. There was one gentleman, his name is Raz. He works at Erasmo Concepcion. He works for Kansas City Public Schools. And he said, and some people took this the wrong way, but I liked it. I just reframed it a little bit. He said, instead of telling these kids to follow their passion, we need to tell them to follow the paycheck. And because we know STEM careers are lucrative, some people took issue with that because they said, no, our kids still need to do things they're passionate about. So I just reframed it a little bit. What if we could apply what we're passionate about to something that gets us a paycheck? So then we have both. And then we have those jobs that we love, so it feels like we're not going to work. What if we could take cooking and show a kid that loves the culinary arts, how STEM is involved in this? And really allowing them to take those passions and turn it into something that can be profitable.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that connected for me with that was that in terms of helping to close the racial gap is that you have to start with really getting to know the students that you're working with, right? So start with what they're actually interested in, which is just fundamentally good, just youth engagement principles, right? And so what we were hearing from a lot of the educators in particular is that oftentimes in the classroom, the expectation is for students to be right? So they're trying to get you the right answer, whatever it is. But there is an understanding in STEM that failure is actually, it's important, right? And it's informative. And so this idea that pushing our educators to think about how do we, one, support failure in the classroom and we teach students, but two, how do we start asking them, what are you really interested in? And figuring out how to then introduce them to an avenue of STEM that they may not have considered, which is kind of what you were saying with the cooking.
Yeah, absolutely. And another aha moment as I'm thinking about this, kind of not related, but it's kind of related to what Andrew said earlier about the idea of the gatekeepers and finding those people who can throw open the doors to opportunity. We know we need that, getting proximate to power, but it was also about, I did a professional development with Kansas City Public Schools and making sure everyone knows their role as a gatekeeper. Everybody in this room is a gatekeeper to accessibility and opportunities for students. Every single one of you are. So it's just allowing each person to really dig into what is your role as a gatekeeper and making sure that every student has opportunities to STEM careers, STEM pathways, STEM post-secondary experiences.
Right. So one of the things in this document that we've alluded to a couple times is that we wanted people to be able to walk away with something actionable. So we created what we called a framework for being able to kind of step into this work. And we tried to do it in a way because we understood that there would be people coming to this work from so many different perspectives, right? Whether they're educators, parents, or whether they're nonprofit leaders. And so we tried to craft something that you could walk through yourself and kind of ask yourself some big questions to get to how you could have an impact on closing the racial gap in STEM. Because everyone here has a sphere of influence, right? Like not everybody is gonna revolutionize the entire education system, but somewhere from where you are, you can have an impact, right? So what we're hoping is that this framework is a kind of jumping off point for individuals who are interested in doing this work. So I'd love to know, Christy, how you might have engaged with this framework and the work that you were doing.
Yeah, so one of the things, like I work a lot with Kansas City Public Schools, Kansas City, Kansas, Hickman, Grandview, our urban populations that are considered our more marginalized communities. All that means is that they haven't been given the same opportunities as some of our less marginalized communities. So one of the things I did, particularly with Kansas City Public Schools, I worked with their STEM coordinator and really worked through with her, how do you apply this framework to the work that you do? And then she gave me the opportunity to speak with the teachers. Now, how do you apply portions of this framework to the work that you do? And eventually I've had the opportunity to present to John Deere, and we're gonna circle back around to them now that this report is completely done and ask them, how do you apply this framework to the work that you do? Because that's what this is. And I'm gonna invite all of you, take one of those reports and then ask yourself, how do you apply this framework to your practice, to the work that you do, because that's what it's for. It's going to take all of us to remove these barriers, to recognize our role in this work, and to begin to work together across our city to close this gap.
Absolutely. So that was kind of the gist of the questions that we had. I think one of the things I would just like to add as a takeaway from the document, like we had kind of 4 ultimate outcomes of how we think you could close the racial gap. One was advocate for resource equity, right? There's always the money, but also in that it was about representation. We included representation as a resource, right? Being able to see people that look like you. The second one was cultivating an excitement for STEM, right? At the, getting babies at the very youngest ages as possible, creating that sense of belonging that Chrissy talked about. And then, sorry, I'm losing the third one. Oh, foster an atmosphere of belonging. That was a separate one, sorry. But then the fourth one, which I thought was really interesting, was think collectively and be honest about the tough stuff, right? So that's getting to kind of what Chrissy was saying. Well, one, we all have a role to play. If this is important to us, which I think it should be, I think it should be important for Kansas City, right? Because we are missing an opportunity to really engage a whole demographic of youth that could be part of our future, right? Our future economy, the prosperity of our city, and we don't want to lose those opportunities. But I wanted to point out, when we talked about that think collectively, one of our panelists pointed out that oftentimes we have a lot of people who are creating programs for students to go into work environments, and yet the work environments are not ready for those students. And so that's why everybody has a role to play, because maybe there are tough questions that need to be happening in those organizations. But also another panelist said, and in addition to that, we need to be preparing our students mentally for a world that might not necessarily be as accepting as them as we want them to be. So it's just, it's a lot to do, but I think that together we could actually make some impact.
So, and another thing, in getting real about the tough stuff, I sometimes have to hold my tongue a little bit, but I'm not going to. We're family here already. But someone said to me, I had the opportunity to be a part of this Kauffman Foundation community of practice around racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. And someone said there that sometimes we're not just Kansas City stuck, but we're Kansas City nice. Mm-hmm. So we got to stop being Kansas City nice, and we have to be willing to, we're in Missouri. Let's just be real. We have to be willing to tell those people who are not on board. We've actually had some people who've actually, said to us, I'm not really interested in working with this around this whole DE&I thing. Well, all DE&I is saying is that everyone has a place and a space at the table. If you're not interested in working with an organization that's just saying everyone has a place and a space at the table, well, there's the door. And we have to be willing, and we have to be brave enough to have those courageous conversations, and then also recognize that sometimes people just don't know what they don't know. So we maybe need to have a different conversation that brings someone on board and helps them understand the importance of this work. Another thing that a really important development was the importance of engaging youth voice. I think that some of the most powerful learning came from what our students told us, what the young people told us. My own son, he said that one of the reasons that he is where he is at Mizzou, pre-med, pretty much a full ride scholarship. He's been on a FIRST Robotics team since he was in 3rd grade. And he wasn't ever really interested in the robot, but it was the research components. And then when more kids that looked like him started to join, that robotics team became his family. And it kept him engaged, it kept him interested, and led him to the path that he's on right now. And so one of the things that is coming from this work that I'm gonna do is establishing a youth leadership council. So these students will come in, we'll meet monthly around fun themes, and then have that kind of inform the work that the KC STEM Alliance does from a young person's perspective. Another thing that we're going to do is make sure we found that a lot of times our students of color, they don't do well on like the ACT test. They don't do well on those types of exams. So what can we do to help them be better with the math and science portions? That's another thing that came from this work. How can we provide support to help those students? And I think Andrea and her organization, the Casey Action Fund, they're going to be able to help guide us with that as well.
Yes. I was just thinking, because the data around what's happening in our schools for all students is really, really challenging, and something that I think as a community we need to decide is important. So that's all we have for today, though.